Welcome, everybody. We're back from our last episode where we talked about potentially exiting Canada and coming down to the lovely Latin American region and why you might want to do that. We spoke a lot about taxes on the last one, and that's obviously one of the big reasons why you'd want to do that. But my name is Patrick Hiebert. My special guest again today is Erik Vik, and we are going to chat a little bit more on the second episode here of why you might want to consider expatting out of Canada and into this region that we're down in here. And currently we're in our offices in Panama City, Panama, the country of Panama, not Florida, and enjoying our lives here and just kind of want to spread the news about it. So, Erik, where should we get started today?
I think we should talk about houses because I think there's an opportunity of a lifetime that's happening in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, we touched on it a little bit in the last episode about the cost of housing in Canada versus the cost of housing in countries in Latin America. You can, in a lot of cases, you could get 4 or 5 homes of the same quality down here that you could in Canada for that amount of money if you sold your house in Canada. So the opportunity right now, which is frankly a housing bubble in Canada, and we've all lived, at least those of us at our age have lived through the crashes of those before. But, I think some of the statistics and the reasons behind why Canadian housing prices are so high is important to know, too, and what could happen. So maybe you want to touch on, the immigration and that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what we're worried about is that as humans, if something is on a trajectory, we assume that it's just going to stay on that, right? So I think Canadians have become very complacent and just thinking that real estate's going to be going on forever. But let's establish first that there is a bubble. So I'm looking at the UBS Global Real Estate Bubble Index for 2023. And there's only 2 places in the entire world that are more overvalued than Canada, and specifically comparing Toronto. So that's Zurich and Tokyo. So Toronto is number 3. Congratulations.
So if you're from Japan or Germany, you might want to listen to this too.
That's true. That's true. And then going to another website, Statista, where I'm looking at the house price to income ratio in selected countries worldwide by the 4th quarter of 2022. And there's only 4 countries that have a higher home price to income ratio, and that's Luxembourg, Portugal, which I'm sure a lot of expats have looked at. And yeah. I went to go look at it myself, and
it's not really a fair competition either because the salary's so low that's what skews that.
Yeah, and I went there and they're like, you're too late. Home prices like doubled since 2019. It's like, wow. This is a bit later. It's hard to find current data, but even as of 2021, it took 8 times the average household income to buy an average home in Canada. And then in the 1980s, that used to be 3. So I think, throughout history, it has been about, our parents. I think there was like maybe 1 or 2 times their annual salary when they first bought their homes. And then by the time we were kids, maybe it was 3 times, and now it's 8 times. So, I mean, these things can't continue forever. We don't know when it's going to break, but it is prone to break.
Well, yeah, and I got to admit that, when my kids were growing up and they were, late teens, early 20s, telling me this, that, it was easier to buy a home when you were younger or our age. I'd be like, you just got to work a little harder. But now I started looking at the stats, and they're definitely right. And I looked at it actually further back to the 40s and 50s when my parents were buying homes. And it was, it was 1.5 times your annual salary to buy a home. So it was, we had it a little harder than they did now, but now, it's getting exponential. And if something's not sustainable, it's just not going to continue.
That's right. The fundamentals will eventually come home to roost, and we can't pick the day, but it's getting pretty crazy. I got a really interesting slide that compares the United States to Canada, and we're going to kind of get into why. So yes, the Canadian market is overvalued, but now we're going to start talking about some of the dangers in that and like why it may not stay overvalued forever. So I have a chart, and we'll probably be able to pull it up. So in the United States, home prices have gone up since the 2008 financial crisis. We're kind of back at those levels, but their income has come up as well. Their disposable income is still higher than the home prices. And look at this chart. This is shocking. So from 2000, you know, our income has come up a little bit, but home prices have outpaced that at an insane level. Like in the States, they'd have more disposable income than the price of their homes.
They did 20 years ago. And
yeah. And we're at...
even there, it's rough.
We're at double. Like, we are so different than the United States.
Well, I think that, you know, some of the fundamental, for me, it really boils down to two things that are, you know, in danger of changing this whole situation. And you mentioned it's an opportunity in Canada. I totally agree. I mean, the opportunity right now to take your asset that you have in Canada, if you're a homeowner, and turn that into an asset down here that's going to capital gain and not lose, it is just a rare situation at the levels that it's at right now. And people probably don't realize that. They're maybe afraid, or they don't really know what they're getting into down here. Obviously, we're here to help you with that. But I think there's two main things that will change this whole situation, and could change overnight. If the immigration into Canada slows down, or you know, in a tiny degree, that's really what's propping it up. There's a lot more immigration into Canada than there are available homes. And the other thing is the red tape. I touched on it the other day on the last episode. We were talking about a buddy of mine playing hockey saying that you got about 30 years left before the bureaucracy kills your country. And one of the things he meant was you won't be able to build homes. Developers won't want to build homes because it's just too much, you know, bureaucracy and red tape to go through. And until that changes, and you hear Pierre Poilievre in Canada talk about removing that and trying to create a higher inventory, which is great. It's definitely needed. But the moment there's a higher inventory and a larger supply, you know, obviously, you know what happens to prices when you have a large supply. So between immigration potentially slowing down and the inventory of homes increasing, it could really burst the bubble. And people, you know, would look at it in a couple of years from now potentially and say, you know, I really wish I'd taken advantage of the opportunity that I have right now.
That's right. That's right. And so we've established that there's crazy high prices and that it's on the cusp. It could be on the cusp of falling over. And we should revisit why Canada might be on the cusp of massive underperformance. And we all know that looking at the debt, it went crazy from, we had to have 721 billion in 2020, and now we have 1.1 trillion. So that's feeding massive inflation and propping up these houses. But what's really worrying to me is the productivity gap that continues to happen in Canada. So, like, yes, we're creating inflation and we're ramping up the houses, and the immigration is keeping it up there. But the fundamentals of Canada continue to get really bad from an economic point of view. I got a chart here that's comparing the productivity gap with the United States. And so back in the 90s, if you put us at par, we're now down to being 78% as productive as the United States. So, and foreign investment is fleeing Canada. We're not productive. Like, it's not a culture of competition on the business side. Well, I'd argue the only thing that we're competitive at is hockey.
and sometimes less competitive at that these days. But, you know, this is controversial and all that as well. But, you know, well, we can continue on. So I'm going to take us on the tangent if I go on that one. So we'll continue on that. But, you know, I think one of the purposes of us wanting to do these kind of podcasts and stuff is to kind of explain to people that there really is an option for you. And we enjoy helping people. You know, my wife, Andrea, is a doctor, and these days she really just helps us more on the side of helping people find the homes that they want in Latin America. And she still feels, you know, this very rewarding kind of position because she's helping people do something just like she was as a doctor. And so, you know, I think we really would encourage people to contact us if you have any of these things are resonating with you in terms of the thoughts that you're having. There's a lot of friends that we have down here that have made the move. There's a large expat community down here. So you're not going to lack friends. It's safe. It's frankly safer than most of North America these days. So, you know, just to inject that, but it's really, you know, something that I think a lot of people just go, you know, it's hard to make that first move, right? To say, okay, at very least come down and check it out, because this opportunity that you have right now, when I moved down to this part of the world, it was already an opportunity, but I was more, around the last recession where homes had lost their value. So I wasn't trading across at 5 to 1. Right? So it's just a heck of an opportunity right now that I really hope people will take care of. And we were talking about earlier a bit of the culture. I mentioned in the last episode too that you're always only 3 generations away from kind of not realizing how things could go. And we're Canadian. We can say this as Canadians. The culture of Canadians is really a culture of people that haven't really gone through hardships. So if you're like that, it's like you said, when the trajectory of a stock is going up, you think it's just going to keep going up. And houses are going up, it's just going to keep going up. We all know that's not true, but that's what our human nature tells us. And when you're in a country like Canada, and it's been generations of peaceful and a great place to live, most people just think it's never going to change. But I'm sure, the people of, Poland in the 30s probably felt that way too. Right? So, it's just not the way the world works. So again, can kind of take it off on a tangent, but if you're thinking about it, really think about it seriously and talk to us. We're happy to talk to you about the opportunities that are there. And even if you don't end up in one of our communities, we create freedom, sustainability-oriented communities, which I think will resonate with the type of people that are interested in what we're talking about. But even if you don't end up in one of ours, we still want to help people, get out of these situations that they may not even realize they're in. So sorry, a little random.
No, that's okay. I have an idea how I'm going to edit that, but I wanted to go back to a point that Erik said that it takes 8 times the average income to buy a household. And I think that in the last episode, you mentioned that an average house is upwards of a couple of million.
Yeah.
Okay, so how would you compare those houses, like the actual houses that you're paying for, versus the houses that they can get in one of our communities here, for example?
I think if we compared the stats were that the average home price in Ontario was $900K, and in BC it was 1.1 million, which is quickly going up. I think if we just concentrate on Ontario, so that $900K home, let's just say it's a nice, decent home. I would say in Panama, we could build that home, ignoring the price of the lot, for, what would you think, about 200?
Yeah, it's probably a $200,000 home here, or maybe a little bit less. So it's in that ballpark. I mean, we make some pretty nice homes, right? So when I'm thinking of a $900,000 home in Toronto or a $1 million home in Vancouver, those are not nice homes.
No,
sorry.
Right. I mean, that's a 3-bedroom 1980s house with a beat-up kitchen.
Yeah,
no
basically he's renovating.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, it's hard when you've been in that environment. Like if you're living in a suburb of Toronto and your home is worth $850,000, and you just see all the homes around you are either a little bit above that or a little below that, you just think that's normal. But when you get out and start shopping around the world, you'll realize that isn't normal. And obviously when you move to an area like this region here, you get other benefits like the climate. We're not going to get, I don't think in Panama here, well, in the Highlands it can get pretty cool, but it's, you're never going to get snow. But so there's lots of benefits to it.
I think if there's something that I could get excited about, it would be about sharing like the personal philosophy about when things are so good and you can see that there's some headwinds coming. It's in our nature, and it's especially in our Canadian nature, to ignore it. And I really want people to not ignore it. So it may not be this year, it might be 3 years, but it could be 3 months too. And we've already established it's way overvalued. The cost of living in Canada is high, taxes are high, and you got a really expensive house, and it's becoming a tyrannical place. It's like it's set up for you to look elsewhere, even if it's not Latin America. It's like, and don't be scared of looking around. Like there's like-minded people everywhere.
I think a lot of people also feel like it's unpatriotic. And I'm a huge fan of Canada. I love Canada. I'm not a huge fan of the current administration. And part of that concern is not like, oh, we can fix that. We'll just elect somebody else next time. That's not going to fix it. Not anymore. Like, it's going to take decades to get out of the trouble that the economy in Canada is in. And unfortunately, that's just saddling children and grandchildren with that problem. I mean, you can't buy down that debt to get back to normal again without either a lot of taxation or a complete change in the mindset. And we were talking the other day too about, well, regardless of what your feelings are about climate change, the obsession with climate change in countries like Canada and its carbon tax is absolutely ridiculous. Carbon tax is never going to fix the problem. Everybody with a brain knows that. It's like, it's not really an issue. I'm amazed that people are accepting it, you know. Like, I saw a bill somebody sent me from Canada the other day where it was, you know, a bigger container of heating oil or whatever that they're buying. So it's like $800 worth of actual oil. And the carbon tax was way more than that. It was over $2,000 by the time they got, you know, through all the taxes. So it's just, you know, and it's not like that carbon tax is going anywhere to help anything in the environment anyway. So
I don't know one person that's ever gotten a carbon tax rebate. I keep hearing about it, and I've asked everyone. It's almost like a myth.
Well, and if they are, it's just a form of socialism. You're taking from one person and giving to another, and it's
after administrating it.
Yeah, after taking your cut off of it in the government. But I mean, I'm going to go down that rabbit hole here for a second, and people can feel the way they feel about it. I'm pretty open about being very libertarian. I don't like big government, and I don't like taxes. And the less of those things you can have, the better the area is. And we're lucky to have that kind of, to the extent we have it here in Latin America and a lot of the countries. And so we had, you know, I'll take a personal example. I have a guy that became a friend. He contacted us. He wanted to buy a home from one of our communities on the beach here in the tropics. This one happened to be in Nicaragua. And he had signed the sales agreement. Everything was going through. He asked his bank to transfer the funds down here. And unfortunately, I wouldn't say it unfortunately because I supported it too, but he had donated to the trucker rally during a couple of years ago. And country froze his bank account. So make a long story short, he was basically labeled as a terrorist. He's a really nice guy. Him and his wife, they donate, you know, they donate a lot of money to helping animals in the Middle East, you know, rescue animals and things like that. And because of that only added to the problem because he was sending money into Egypt, and they decided that was part of his terrorist thing. And it's like, come on. Anyway, and long story short, he couldn't buy the home because he just couldn't get his money out of that account. They froze it for months. And then even when they started considering letting it go, it was like, you're not transferring this out of the country. To me, I just don't understand. That's not the Canada I grew up in. I wouldn't have stayed a day in the country if that would happen to me. And then, you know, enacting the War Act, what used to be called the War Act, they pleasanted it up a little into the Emergencies Act. And enacting that on their own people, that wasn't what it was meant for. And then it was later determined to be illegal.
And there's no consequences.
And no consequences at all for it. And you know, sorry, I'm not a big Trudeau fan. I think actually it was when he got elected. I thought it was going to be good for the country that he was seen as popular around the world, like a young leader with the new ideas. So I was kind of drawn in at that point too, but it didn't take very long to see through that. And, you know, I think anybody that's kind of watching this show has probably realized that, or seen the part where he basically said if you weren't vaccinated, and regardless of whether you're, you know, anti-vaxxer or a regular vaxxer or whatever you are, or you just don't like experimental vaccinations and you didn't get vaccinated in Canada, he basically called you misogynist and racist. Now, I don't understand the connection to not wanting to take you know, an experimental vaccine. You decide that you don't feel good about that based on the scientific stats, and then he calls you misogynistic and racist. And then on top of that, he asked the question in that interview, should we tolerate this? That's when I reflect back to what my parents used to say about early, you know, before World War II in Germany. That was the statement about Jews, right? Should we tolerate this?
I know it sounds ridiculous, and Canadians can't comprehend that this could happen in their country.
Yeah.
We already talked about it. My dad fled the country. I know tons of people who are fleeing because they still remember. Like, I meet all these Eastern Europeans in the mall in Calgary, and I'd ask them how things are going, and they were the only people in Canada that were like, alarm bells were going off because they had just fled that, and they were so angered that they got duped into coming to this free country, and then it's starting to turn on them.
It's strange, and unfortunately, we get kind of labeled as conspiracy theorists for saying this, but so be it. I think history will pan out, and we'll realize that. I mean, I hope that Canada turns it around, but right now the signs aren't very good. And there's nothing that's permanent about it either. If somebody decides, like, I'm going to have a second Plan B residency in Latin America or somewhere else in the world, and they, have your kind of landing pad home to come to down here, and if you decide, that's not for you or whatever, a few years from now, chances are pretty high that you'll actually have made some money on your home, because with all the expats and exodus of people coming out of countries like Canada, the U.S., Northern Europe, that it's really, creating maybe someday there will be a housing bubble here. I don't know. Right now we're not there. And, you can do that for a couple of years and decide, like, oh, maybe it's not for me, and maybe Canada, got itself back on track or something, and you can go back. But right now, I would just encourage people to take advantage of the opportunity that's there.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, some of my friends that think a government change is going to fix things. And I was kind of like the same, like, oh yeah, Trudeau's doing so poorly. He's likely to get voted out. And then I started running it through, and I think you got the same idea. So why don't you take us through the example of that government coming in, and how probably over the long term it doesn't fix anything.
Yeah, I mean, we can feel free to jump in here too, but in my opinion, what are your ways out of that situation when you ran the economy into the ground to the extent that they have, and it continues on that trajectory? Let's say the Conservatives come in. Like, what are their alternatives, right? Like, what can they do? They can start, ramping up oil and production and things like that, which would definitely help take advantage of the natural resources that the country has. But that takes a long time. And in the meantime, they're probably going to have to tax more to try to get the deficit out. And
yeah, because it's so extreme. And what I think will happen is they'll come in and they're going to have to do all the adult things that the Liberals didn't do, right? So they're going to have to cut programs. They might have to, maybe they can cut taxes, but we're having such a high deficit, or such a high debt, that might be difficult. So what's going to happen is that they're going to be viewed as these saviors to come in and fix things. But in 4 years, as usual, maybe it takes 8 years, Canadians forget how bad it was.
Yeah.
And then the Liberals will come along and they'll start promising all this stuff, and they'll get voted in again, and then they will truly finish off the job.
Yeah, it doesn't take much to destroy it from where it's at now. I mean, like you said, it's going to be unpopular. It's like, there's lots of examples down here in Latin America too. When Bukele came in El Salvador, he was riding on changing the safety thing. Well, that obviously, if you look back now, today, he's wildly popular. He's the most popular president in the history of the world. He's got like a 93% popularity rating.
Yeah.
And he just got reelected. Surprise, surprise. But there was a stage at which he wasn't, right? He brought in Bitcoin, first of all, then Bitcoin started going down, which wasn't popular for him. He had to really crack down on like, putting in martial law, basically. And that wasn't popular. And if he hadn't turned it around in the term that he had, he would have got booted out, and the country would go right back to socialism and fail again. Right?
So it was amazing that he turned it around just in time before an election.
Yeah.
If an election had come sooner, you think he would have been...
Well, if it had come a year and a half earlier, he probably would have had trouble, because that was kind of when he started sending the military into towns to get rid of gangs.
Yeah.
And that was dicey at that point. And now, I mean, we see it in Ecuador, right? So Daniel Noboa has been elected president. They have a different kind of system. The president, basically, the existing socialist president quit because he was so unpopular and he was kind of afraid of what was going to happen to him. So Noboa ran on basically a more capitalist approach, right? And got elected, very popular, youngest president, I think, in the history of Latin America. He's in his 30s. Very popular right now, but he only gets the last term of the last guy, right? So he has 18 months starting in November, so he's got less than that now, getting down to about a year left before he gets into another election. And he's just basically took Bukele's script from El Salvador, and because they were it was crazy because Ecuador 20 years ago was one of the nicest, safest countries in the region. And I just saw the stats a couple of days ago. It's now the second worst in homicides and safety, security behind Haiti. So he's got his work cut out for him, but I just hope he's got the time to do it. Right now he's really popular because people see that that's what needs to be done. But that is risk, right? If Canadians are different, right? They haven't been through decades of socialism and communism to see that what can happen. We're lucky here in Panama because it's a pretty capitalist sort of stable country. Right?
Yeah, I was going to say we should contrast Panama. It's been the most stable of all the Latin American countries.
Yeah, and in my 2 cents worth is the reason it's capitalist is because of the canal. You have a constant stream of funds coming into the country that it can build into infrastructure and do that, and it's got the ability to do it. It doesn't have the people crying for handouts as much as some of the countries, like, how the socialists work, right? They all come in and promise, they'll buy the votes, right? And then it's always the same. And then people don't realize how much better it could be if they just had a country based on merit instead of handouts. And so we're lucky here. But what's interesting, I think I mentioned it in the last episode, I saw stats the other day where a lot of Europe, and even when, I talk to my kids' friends or whatever, they're like, well, maybe it would be better if Canada was socialist. It's like, you have no idea what you're asking.
You've not studied history.
Yeah. Like, that has worked nowhere in the world. It's proven. But it's amazing that, the 20s and 30-year-olds in some cases are contemplating that. Right? They've heard so much mainstream media about how, then we'd have free this and free that. Nothing's free. Like, somebody's paying for it.
Absolutely. I wanted to just touch on, you're talking about how Panama's relatively well. One thing that struck me when I was driving around, and I did mention it to everyone that I've met, is that everywhere I go, it seems like I'm driving through relatively, for Latin America, middle-class neighborhoods. Like, I'm used to exploring Mexico and Guatemala and Brazil, and I've seen, everyone's happy, but I've seen like real poverty. And when I drive around here, I'm in the middle of nowhere, and I'm like, these houses are nice and people are taking care of their yards, and I'm like, there's middle class everywhere. Like, I'm sure that there's the odd little area that's not well, but that's what's really struck me.
Yeah, and I honestly believe that a lot of that is due to the canal, because there's been an injection of cash into the country over a period of time regularly, and there's other things other than this last year where they kind of had an issue with the copper mine. They allowed for economic development of things like mines and logging and those sorts of things, where Canada's on this environmental bend where they're canceling all that. It's their bread and butter, and that's what the country was built on. And it's huge. You could fit probably 60 Panamas into Canada. I don't know, probably more, but never really measured the two countries together, so that's just a random thought. But realistically, and it's interesting you mentioned, like, there is a lot of poverty in parts of Central America, especially, but poverty and happiness are not connected down here. Like nowhere in Nicaragua, yeah, I guess probably nowhere, right? But I noticed it here because Nicaragua always gets voted in the top 3 of happiest countries in the world. It's the second poorest country in the Americas.
Yeah.
So it does, if you live by the ocean and you can catch fish and bananas and mangoes grow all day long, you're not worried about your meal for tomorrow. So that is a little different than if you're living in Minnesota and you're not well off and you have to wonder about how you're going to pay rent and you're going to get kicked out on the street and it's -30.
And you're waiting for the bus.
Yeah.
At 5 o'clock in the morning and it's really dark.
Yeah. But so yeah, it's just a different world. And one of the other things, it's more ethereal or whatever, but we talked a little bit about it the other day, and which is the career-driven versus the family-driven thing. I think that's important for people that are considering moving down here. It's not like you're just taking your current 9-to-5 lifestyle and transplanting it to a warmer climate. You really are changing the backdrop that you live in. And that was one of the most intriguing things to me when I first moved down to Central America, is that I was walking down the street with my kids were very small at the time, probably 6, 4, and 2 years old, and little blonde German kids basically, right? and they sort of stuck out, right? And one of the guys came out on the street, and he's basically, you know, my Spanish wasn't very good, still isn't very good, but he came and talked to me and said, "Oh, you're a wealthy man, right?" Or I can't remember what term he used in Spanish, but like, basically you're a rich guy. And I was thinking in my head, stupid like that, oh, he just means like, you got lots of money and I'd like some of it, right? You know, can you give me a handout? And what he tried to relay, and one of the guys was, you know, sort of translating for him, was that no, he's saying you're very lucky, you have a beautiful family, and you know that you're very welcome in our village, and it's very cool to have you. Like, because we went to places that nobody else would go, right? So a lot of these villages had never seen somebody with blue eyes before, right? So it was a little different, but that really stayed with me, right? It's like very welcoming, very friendly, family. Like my daughters, when they were 16, would drive around Nicaragua or wherever in a Hilux truck by themselves and get a flat tire, and I would never worry. Somebody would come out of the woodwork and, you know, fix the tire for them, and they keep going. And that was just because, you know, it's just a different culture of taking care of families. Like, it takes a village to raise a family is really a thing here. So, all right, everybody, I think that's it for today. That's the 2 episodes basically on why you might want to consider taking the opportunity to leave Canada when it's a good time to go and come down to a region like we're in down here in Latin America. Hope you got some good information out of this. Feel free to do all the stuff that you do on social media, subscribe, ring the bell, whatever, all the notification stuff. But more importantly, please do comment on these videos. If you think I'm a crazy conspiracy theorist, I'm okay with that. Feel free to mention that. But, you know, if it resonates with you and anything like that, feel free to, you know, mention that as well. And always feel free to contact us. We're really here and eager to help fellow Canadians find their way down here. So thanks.
Fantastic.